Redditors who have hired a private investigator, what did you find out? I have a story about private investigators doing a hilariously shit job. So, years ago, my brother injured his back at work because of his employer's unsafe work practices. During the ensuing suit, my brother's lawyer was given a folder full of documents from the employer's team. Turns out, they had hired a PI to investigate my brother to prove that his injury was faked. Well, unfortunately, the PI had been taking pictures of me operating an ATV-mounted leaf hopper. My brother walked into the court hearing and watched the color drain from the opposing lawyers' faces when he introduced himself, looking nothing like me. I briefly worked for a PI when I was much younger, like 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which is in a tiny strip mall smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real PI's office looked like. Pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk in a polo shirt and slacks. We got to chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked me what kind of work I was expecting. I told him probably a lot of boring work sifting through papers in the library and courthouse. He laughed again. He did that a lot. We called him Santa because of that and his white beard, and gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months, during which we did a lot of insurance work. That consisted mostly of sitting in a car, reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or leg cast walking to or from his car, and 2 or 3 times taking pictures of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. But Santa also had a much reduced rate for tracking down biological parent siblings' children. We had one case where this woman in her 30s wanted to find her bio mom. We went on our usual course, visiting courthouses, city halls and libraries to track this woman down. We spent a whole month on it. We also worked other cases during that time, which was a bit longer than usual, as the women didn't know her mother's name, only her adopted parents, who had passed years ago. The women didn't have any of the adoption paperwork either, and didn't know where it would be filled. This was in the 90s, when not everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over, and got a name. I was running late. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I made to drop off the copies of the paperwork at his office and go, but the guy stopped me before I could leave. He was all excited by the mother's name. It's his wife. His wife had given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called his wife, who dug up her copies of the addition paperwork from back when, and sure enough, it's a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, then went and picked up his wife and drove to the client's home. She's on the phone with her adopted sister, talking about our effort. PI and his wife immediately bear hugged the woman, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to get the words out, so I explained that the woman was her bio mom, and the PI her husband. Fucking beautiful scene, man. That memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. It was enough to put off my then imminent loss of faith in God for another decade or so, that this woman had hired her bio mom's husband to find her bio mom. I don't really know the full details, but the detective brought his own dog and took a list from my brother of common locations like parks and trails and former residences in the area where his dog would be familiar. I was told the detective's dog got him searching in the right direction, and from there he'd use the list. I suppose he does it enough that he'd have some idea of a lost dog's behavior too. Either way, he found him about 1 1/4 mile from my brother's place, hiding in a drainage ditch. I also understand that once he had an area narrowed down, he asked around and a woman had seen him, and that narrowed it further. Took the guy the better part of 12 hours, but he turned up safe and only a little worse for wear. The detective, for a lack of a better word, hires out to find both people and animals that are missing. As for the dog, my brother deemed his living arrangement not ideal, and the pup now lives with our folks in Florida, where he's got a fenced-in yard and is happy as can be. And a babysitter we thought was stealing from us. Luckily our neighbor was a PI couple, and they ran a background check for $10. Babysitter had a string of DUIs, and a few days before a large fine was due, my camera disappeared. He also stole money from my kids' piggy banks. He sort of disappeared, but was also really into Instagram, so I surreptitiously followed him. He started babysitting again for a single mom, easy target, and posted a lot of fun pics with his family. I tracked down the mom and sent her a long email detailing out his whole scam. She said we were right, and it was clear he'd been stealing from her business. He has since gone underground, but I still Google him regularly to see what he's up to. He's been able to avoid arrests for a while now. My oldest niece's dad married a woman who was controlling. She ended up convincing him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which ended up stressing my sister out so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a PI and found out that his wife was using that to buy groceries instead of the money he was giving her, and that she was getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors and a bunch of other fucked up shit. He ended up contacting her parents, who he was told were dead. After he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she took from him. He wasn't the first guy she had done it to. She also wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently doing time in prison for a handful of charges. Hadn't heard from my mom since I was about 15, very unstable due to drugs and alcohol etc. When I was 29 I decided it was time to find out what happened to her. I figured if she was a Jane Doe somewhere then I could put her to rest, and if she was alive then I wanted to let her know that I forgave her. Hired a pie to help. I guess she was moved by my story, and so she also ran info for the man my mother was apparently married to, on the house, and with one clue from his report I was able to track them down. I wouldn't have found my mom, alive and was just starting out on recovery after being homeless and addicted for many years, if it wasn't for the pie who kindly ran an extra report for free. Mom has remained sober now for about 7 years and is probably the healthiest she's ever been, physically and emotionally. My mother's dad walked out on mom, my aunt, and my grandmother when mom was just 5. A few years later, my grandmother died of a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents, but she always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she saved up a bit and hired a pie to track him down. Turns out he moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he wound up in prison for armed robbery and so other violent crimes. He died in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think mom got a lot of closure out of that. She was able to see that life would have most likely been even worse had he stayed. At least living with her grandparents, she was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal modern family. 2 moms, 2 dads. Over time it became apparent her stepdad wasn't around much. Holidays, birthdays, you name it, he'd pop in to say hi, grab a nap, whatever, then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal, just the way it had always been since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and drug trafficking. But I thought it strange and started making jokes about him having another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking, because she gets a favor from the pie at her law firm. Sure enough, he has not 2 but 3 wives around the state and 5 other stepchildren between them. My sister-in-law breaks the news to her mother who immediately changes the locks and files for divorce. They never speak again. Cold turkey. Divorce is even uncontested. As a foo they also send the report to his other wives. Edit. I thought I was late to the thread, so I wasn't expecting as many reactions. Thanks for the gold. To answer some of the questions. Yes, polygamy is illegal, but it's not really worth prosecuting except to make an example of people. I don't know if my mill was his first wife or not. I do know that one of the wives had been married and divorced him between their marriage. How does it happen? Counties don't exactly share marriage certificates. His families were pretty far from each other. Was their wedding legal? No idea. Probably the separation was just a formality for paperwork purposes, which is why it went to court, why it went uncontested and why he never showed up again. I think he reached out once or twice, but she never answered the phone. And if he ever showed up again, we weren't told about it. My mill is a strong independent woman of faith who just didn't know. He fooled his stepdaughters for 15 years too. I was the recipient of the pie. I came home from work one day and my BF asked to have my engagement ring as he wanted to take it to be professionally cleaned. The second he handed it over he accused me of cheating on him. The conversation went back and forth for ages. I was beside myself, I couldn't believe what he was saying and he would not believe I was innocent. He then told me he'd had me followed for 6 weeks by a pie who had seen me get into a red Mini. It was a girl I knew giving me a lift to work, but he would not believe me. I knew then it was over and packed my things and left. I told him to get in touch with the pie and have another look at this so-called evidence that I was cheating. An hour later he turns up at where I was staying begging to have me back. He'd realized his mistake. There was no way I was going to get back with someone who would behave that way, though, so we parted ways. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. Best pie story I have is where we hired one to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial, even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The pie we hired got some good pics that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel of the photos was one where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife. Had his hand on her ass and everything. Later in a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like Mr. Smith, obviously not his real name, who is the woman in this picture. We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well. The guy went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least, he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out the other woman was gonna be deposed, he was gonna have to get a family law attorney as well, because the divorce papers would soon follow.